"Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately. Please, this is a restricted area." Norman Randall, 83 years old, with knuckles like polished river stones and eyes the color of a faded sky, did not move. He stood at the threshold of the cockpit, his body a frail but unyielding dam against the current of fear sweeping through the airplane. The Boeing 777 gave a sickening lurch, a giant shuddering in its metal bones, and the screams from the cabin crescendoed into a unified wail of terror. The flight attendant, a young man named Kyle with a perfectly coiffed haircut and a name tag that read lead flight attendant, put a hand on Norman's arm. It was meant to be firm, commanding, but it trembled. "Sir, you do not understand the gravity of the situation. We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. You cannot be here." Norman's gaze remained fixed past the attendant, on the chaotic array of lights and screens inside the cockpit. He could see the co-pilot slumped over the center console, the captain leaning impossibly far back in his seat, his head against the window, chest still. The plane was on autopilot for now, but it was flying dumb, a blind beast in a sky full of storms and other traffic. The gentle programmed chime that announced turbulence was a mocking counterpoint to the raw human fear that filled the cabin. "Is this some kind of joke?" Kyle asked, his voice cracking, desperation twisting his features into a sneer. "Are you lost? Do you even know where you are, old man?" He saw a grandfather, someone's lost, confused patriarch who'd wandered toward the chaos instead of away from it. He saw a liability. Norman finally turned his head just slightly. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a stillness that was profoundly unsettling. They were deep and clear, and in them Kyle saw not confusion, but a terrifying and absolute calm. An assessment. "I know exactly where I am," Norman said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that had been weathered by time and pressure. "I'm at 34,000 feet in a $30 million aircraft that is about to become a coffin for 164 souls unless someone flies it." He took a steadying breath, the air thin and cold. "Now, son, I suggest you get out of my way." Kyle's face flushed with a mixture of indignation and disbelief. The sheer audacity of the old man was staggering. The captain of the flight crew, the one in charge now, was him. He was trained for this, for crowd control, for emergency procedures. Rule number 1 was to maintain order and secure the cockpit. This man, this relic, was the very definition of disorder. "Sir, I am the authority on this aircraft right now," Kyle said, puffing out his chest, trying to project a confidence he was nowhere near feeling. The plane dipped again, more sharply this time, and a fresh wave of shrieks rolled forward from the cabin. "The last thing we need is a passenger having a hero complex. We have radioed for assistance. The situation is under control." "Is it?" Norman asked, his voice flat. He gestured with a slight nod toward the instrument panel. "Your altitude has dropped 400 feet in the last 90 seconds. Your airspeed is fluctuating. The autopilot is fighting weather it wasn't programmed to anticipate. The situation is not under control. It is a managed fall." Another flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah with wide, terrified eyes, hurried up the aisle. "Kyle, what's going on?" "They're asking for an update. Air traffic control. They sound urgent." "Tell them we are handling it," Kyle snapped, never taking his eyes off Norman. He felt a bead of sweat trace a cold path down his temple. He was losing control, not of the plane but of the narrative. This old man was a focal point of defiance, and in the compressed, high-stakes theater of a metal tube in the sky, that was a dangerous spark. "I asked if there was a pilot on board," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He came forward." Kyle scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "He came forward. Look at him. He probably flew prop planes in the 50s. This is a flying supercomputer. What could he possibly do? We need a current certified 777 rated pilot, not a museum piece." The insult hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Norman didn't flinch. He seemed to absorb the verbal blow as if it were nothing. A puff of wind. His attention was elsewhere, processing 1,000 points of data from the brief glimpse he'd had of the cockpit. He could hear the engines, the strain in their whine. He could feel the vibration of the fuselage, the subtle shifts in pressure. The plane was talking to him, and he was listening. "License," Kyle demanded, his hand outstretched. "If you are a pilot, you will have a license. A current one." Slowly, deliberately, Norman reached into the pocket of his red leather jacket. He pulled out a creased leather wallet, its edges softened by decades of use. He fumbled for a moment with the worn folds, his old fingers not as nimble as they once were. Kyle watched with growing impatience, his foot tapping a frantic rhythm on the carpeted floor. To him, this slow, deliberate search was just more proof of the man's dotage, a sad, final attempt to cling to a relevance long past. He was wasting precious seconds. "Come on, Grandpa. We don't have all day," Kyle muttered, the slur dripping with condescension. "The clock is ticking." "Yes, it is," Norman said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He finally pulled out a small, laminated card. It was an FAA pilot's license. The photo was 20 years old, showing a man with the same steady eyes but fewer lines on his face. The expiration date was valid. Kyle snatched it from his hand. He stared at it, his mind racing. It was real. Norman Randall, private pilot, multi-engine certified. It wasn't an ATP license for a commercial jet, but it wasn't nothing. Still, the gulf between a private multi-engine plane and a Boeing 777 was the difference between a go-kart and a freight train. "This doesn't qualify you," Kyle said, shoving the card back at him. "Not for this. You would be a greater danger than the autopilot." "The autopilot is a tool," Norman said, his voice hardening for the first time. "It follows orders. It cannot improvise. It cannot feel the air. Up there." He nodded toward the churning gray clouds visible through the cockpit window. "You need a feel. You need a pilot." The plane bucked violently, throwing Sarah against the galley wall. A chorus of metallic crashes echoed from the back as service carts overturned. The overhead bins rattled, and the emergency lighting flickered on, casting the cabin in a ghostly, apocalyptic glow. The autopilot disengagement alarm began to blare, a piercing, repetitive shriek that cut through the chaos. The fall was no longer being managed. "We are stalling." Norman's voice cut through the alarm, a blade of pure command. He pushed forward, no longer waiting for permission. Kyle, off balance and paralyzed by the sudden escalation, stumbled back. Norman was in the cockpit. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his age, his hand immediately going to the yoke, his eyes scanning the primary flight display. He saw the critical angle of attack warning, the airspeed bleeding away. With a firm, steady pressure, he pushed the nose down, a counterintuitive move that sent the plane into a controlled dive. The G-forces pressed everyone into their seats, and the stall warning fell silent, replaced by the roar of the engines as they regained purchase on the air. He had saved them for a moment, but they were still in a dive. Kyle, scrambling back to his feet, saw the altitude unwinding like a broken clock. "What are you doing? You're going to crash us." "I'm flying the airplane," Norman said, his knuckles white on the controls. "Something your little box forgot how to do." He eased back on the yoke, slowly, gracefully, coaxing the massive aircraft out of the dive. The nose came up, the horizon leveled out, and the terrible descent arrested. The 777 was stable again, flying level, but now it was in the hands of an unknown ancient man. Kyle felt a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a crash, but the fear of the unknown. He had no protocol for this. His rulebook was blank. This man had just performed a maneuver that required immense skill and nerve, yet he looked like he belonged in a retirement home. The dissonance was jarring. He looked at Norman, truly looked at him, and saw the utter confidence in the set of his jaw, the focus in his eyes. It was the confidence of a man who was not just visiting this world of metal and air, but who was a native of it. Norman reached into his wallet again, his left hand never leaving the controls. He didn't look for his license this time. His fingers found a small, hidden flap of leather. As he pulled it open, a patch was visible, sewn into the very fabric of the wallet. Its colors faded to muted earth tones. It depicted a fox, lean and cunning, its body formed from what looked like carbon fiber, set against a backdrop of a starless black sky. For a split second, the stale, recycled air of the cockpit seemed to vanish, replaced by the scent of jet fuel and damp jungle. The image flashed in his mind, a memory as sharp and clear as the day it was forged. He was 25 years old, his face streaked with sweat and grime, the cockpit of his F-4 Phantom a suffocating cage of heat and vibration. The night sky over North Vietnam was alive with fire, a hellish tapestry of red and green tracers crisscrossing the darkness. An enemy MiG was on his tail, a predator in the dark. He could hear his wingman's frantic calls over the radio, the panicked breathing. But he was calm. He saw the patterns, the geometry of the fight. He rolled, pulled, and dove, not just flying the machine but becoming a part of it, a ghost in the night. He vanished from the MiG's radar, reappearing on its 6, a specter dealing death. When he landed, his flight suit soaked through. His commander had slapped the newly designed patch onto his shoulder. "We're calling you the Carbon Fox," the man had said, "because you're made of the night, untouchable." The memory was gone as quickly as it came, but its power lingered. It was a reminder of who he was, beneath the layers of age and time. He was not just Norman Randall, old man in seat 14B. He was the Carbon Fox. "Sarah," The younger flight attendant had regained her composure. She saw the fragile stability Norman had achieved and understood that Kyle's obstruction was now the single greatest threat to the airplane. He was still sputtering, arguing, trying to reassert an authority that had evaporated the moment the stall warning had sounded. She had to do something. She grabbed the cockpit radio handset, the one used to communicate with the cabin, and more importantly, the ground. Kyle shot her a furious look. "What are you doing? Put that down." She ignored him, her fingers fumbling with the controls. She switched to the emergency frequency, her voice a strained, breathless plea. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Transatlantic 721, we have total pilot incapacitation. The aircraft is currently under the control of a passenger, a volunteer pilot." The voice of the air traffic controller came back instantly, sharp with professional calm but underscored with palpable tension. "Transatlantic 721, we copy your Mayday. We are clearing all traffic in your vicinity. Can you identify the volunteer pilot? We need his name and qualifications. We need to know who is flying your plane." Kyle lunged for the handset, but Sarah turned her body, shielding it. "He's an old man. We don't know he has a private license, but..." Before she could finish, Norman spoke, his eyes still locked on the horizon, his voice a low command that filled the small space. Tell them Carbon Fox is on the stick." Sarah paused, confusion warring with the instinct to obey. The name meant nothing to her. It sounded like something from a child's cartoon. "What? Sir, they need your name." "The name won't mean anything to them," Norman said, his voice flat. "The call sign will." There was an absolute certainty in his tone that was impossible to argue with. He was banking the plane gently, a long, slow turn to a new heading he had somehow divined. He was not just keeping them from crashing, he was taking them somewhere. Hesitantly, Sarah keyed the mic. "ATC, the volunteer pilot. He asks me to relay his call sign. It's a Carbon Fox." There was a moment of dead air on the frequency, a silence that stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. It was an eternity. Kyle let out a bitter laugh. "Carbon Fox. See, he's delusional. We've handed a plane full of people to a madman." But then the controller's voice came back, and every trace of professional detachment was gone. It was replaced by something else, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. "Transatlantic 721. Say again that call sign." "Did you say Charlie Alpha Romeo Bravo Oscar November, Foxtrot Oscar X-ray?" "Affirmative," Sarah said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Carbon Fox." The line went silent again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of frantic, explosive activity. In the dimly lit high-security command center of NORAD, deep within Cheyenne Mountain, Air Force General Marcus Thorne nearly dropped his coffee. The message from the Denver ATC had been piped through to him as a matter of protocol, another civilian emergency to monitor. But the call sign had hit him like a physical blow. "Get me a lock on that transponder now," he barked, his voice echoing through the vast room. A dozen operators jumped into action, their fingers flying across keyboards. A map of the western United States bloomed on the main screen, a blinking red dot indicating the location of Transatlantic 721. "General," a young lieutenant asked, his face pale. "Is that call sign authentic?" "There's only one Carbon Fox," Thorne said, his eyes glued to the screen. "I thought he was dead, or at least faded away like all the other ghosts." He turned to his communications chief. "Get me the 49th Wing at Holloman. I want 2 F-35s in the air 5 minutes ago. I want them scrambled with a direct link to my console. Their mission is escort. Tell them who they are escorting. Use the call sign. They'll understand." He walked over to a secure terminal and typed in an override code. He pulled up a file that was so old it had been digitized from paper records. A black and white photo appeared on the screen. A young man with a cocky grin and the same steady eyes Norman Randall still possessed. Below it, a service record that read like a piece of military fiction. Over 300 combat missions. A kill record that was still classified. Recipient of the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star, a dozen other medals for valor. And a final entry, retired, Brigadier General Norman Carbon Fox Randall. "Clear a flight path for him," Thorne commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for question. "Divert every civilian and military craft in a 200-mile radius. Give him the entire sky, and get him a runway, the longest one we have. Tell Nellis to prepare for the arrival of a legend." Back on the 777, Kyle was reaching his breaking point. The strange exchange with ATC, the old man's unnerving calm, the sheer impossibility of the situation, it had all curdled into a furious, desperate need to reassert control. He saw Norman not as a savior but as a hijacker of circumstance. "That's it. I've had enough," he announced, his voice shrill. He turned to the other flight attendant, a burly man who had been trying to calm passengers at the front of the cabin. "John, help me get him out of that seat. We're putting this plane back on autopilot, and we are going to follow standard procedure." Norman didn't even look at him. He was listening to something else, a faint crackle in his headset. "That would be a mistake," he said calmly. "The mistake was letting you in here," Kyle retorted, moving forward. He grabbed Norman's shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of his jacket. "I am ordering you as the ranking crew member of this flight to relinquish control. If you do not, I will have you physically restrained and you will be arrested for interfering with a flight crew the moment we land." If we land, it was his final, arrogant threat, the ultimate overreach. He was so focused on the man, on the perceived enemy in front of him, that he didn't see what Sarah saw. Her face was pressed against the cockpit window, her mouth agape. "Kyle," she whispered, "look." Out of the churning gray clouds, two shapes emerged with breathtaking speed and precision. They were not birds, not other airliners. They were sleek, angular, and menacing, the color of a storm cloud. Two F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters, the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, materialized as if from thin air. One took up a position off the right wing, the other off the left. They were so close you could see the pilots in their futuristic helmets, their forms steady and calm within their own bubbles of technological supremacy. The arrival was not loud. It was a silent, overwhelming spectacle of power and intent. They weren't there to observe, they were there to serve. The radio, which Norman had switched to a military frequency, crackled to life. The voice that came through was young, professional, and filled with an almost religious reverence. "Carbon Fox, this is Ghost Lead. We rid you 5 by 5. We have you, and we are your escort. The sky is yours, sir. Just tell us where you want to go." Kyle froze, his hand still on Norman's shoulder. He heard the call. He heard the name. He looked from the F-35 hanging impossibly still just a few hundred feet away, to the old man in the pilot's seat. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical shock. His condescension, his arrogance, his entire worldview of the last 30 minutes shattered into a million pieces. His face went chalk white. He slowly, carefully, removed his hand from Norman Randall's shoulder. Norman keyed the mic, his thumb moving with familiar ease. "Ghost Lead, this is Carbon Fox. Good to see you, boys. Let's head for Nellis. I've got a plane full of people who would like to be on the ground." "Roger that, Fox. We'll show you the way home," the pilot replied. Sarah, her eyes shining with tears of relief and awe, took the cabin handset. Her voice, when she spoke to the passengers, was no longer trembling with fear, but with a profound sense of wonder. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you look out your windows, you will see that we are being escorted by two F-35 fighters from the United States Air Force. The gentlemen flying our plane, they know him. They are here for him. Everything is going to be okay." A murmur went through the cabin, and then, one by one, passengers craned their necks to look out the windows. The sight of the fighter jets, symbols of ultimate competence and power, acted as a balm on their frayed nerves. The panic that had held them in its grip for so long finally began to recede, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. They weren't on a falling plane anymore. They were part of a rescue, an event of immense significance. The old man in the cockpit was not a random passenger. He was someone important, a figure of hidden consequence. The power dynamic of the entire flight had been irrevocably inverted, not just in the cockpit, but in the collective consciousness of everyone on board. The landing at Nellis Air Force Base was textbook perfect. Norman handled the massive Boeing 777 with the delicate touch of a surgeon, kissing the runway so gently that the touchdown was little more than a whisper. As the plane taxied toward a waiting phalanx of emergency vehicles and military personnel, a hush fell over the cabin. The flight was over. The ordeal was done. Before the jet bridge could even connect, the cabin door was opened from the outside. A group of Air Force officers stood there, but they did not board. They parted, and a single man in a general's uniform strode up the steps. It was General Thorne. He walked through the galley, his eyes scanning the scene until they landed on Norman, who was calmly going through the shutdown sequence as if he had done it 1,000 times. Thorne stopped at the cockpit door. He did not speak. He simply brought his hand up in a salute so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air. "General Randall," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an honor, sir." Norman finished his checklist, then slowly unbuckled himself. He rose from the pilot's seat, his movements stiff with age, and returned the salute with a tired but steady hand. "Good to be back on the ground, Marcus." Thorne's gaze then fell upon Kyle, who was standing frozen against the galley wall, his face a mask of shame and disbelief. The general's expression turned to ice. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I have the full transcript from the flight recorder. Your conduct was an obstruction. You actively hindered a decorated officer and a national hero from saving the lives of everyone on this plane. Your career in aviation is over." The words were a death sentence, and Kyle visibly crumpled. But before the weight of them could fully crush him, Norman held up a hand. "Easy, Marcus," he said, his voice gentle. The boy was following his training. He was scared. Fear makes people cling to the rules they know, even when the rules no longer apply. He turned to Kyle, and his eyes held no anger, only a deep, weary understanding. The lesson here isn't to punish a man for his fear. It's to write better rules, to create a protocol that allows for the unexpected, that trusts in experience over a job title. Norman then reached up and touched the lapel of his leather jacket, right over his heart. As his fingers brushed the fabric, another memory, another echo surfaced. He was a young lieutenant, fresh out of flight school, being handed his first official flight jacket by his commanding officer. The leather was stiff and new. The CO pointed to the empty patch on the chest. "That's where your story goes," he'd said. "Every pilot has a name, but the sky gives you a title. Go earn it." He remembered the first time he'd heard the name Carbon Fox whispered in a briefing room, a name born in the fire and darkness of combat, a name that meant survival, skill, and something more, an unseen, untouchable presence when things were at their worst. That name was his story. A few weeks later, the news cycle briefly lit up with the story of the hero pilot of Transatlantic 721. The airline, in a public relations masterstroke, announced the immediate implementation of the Randall Protocol, a new set of emergency procedures for assessing and empowering qualified volunteer pilots in a crisis. It was a small change, a footnote in the vast manual of aviation regulations, but it was a legacy. One quiet Tuesday morning, Norman was sitting at his usual table in the local VFW hall, nursing a cup of black coffee. The door opened, and Kyle walked in. He was no longer in his crisp flight attendant uniform. He wore simple jeans and a sweater, and he looked smaller, younger. He walked over to Norman's table and stood there for a long moment, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He didn't offer a long apology or a rambling explanation. He just looked at the old man who had saved his life and 163 others. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet and sincere. He placed a fresh, steaming cup of coffee on the table in front of Norman. "Sir." Norman looked up from his cup, his pale blue eyes meeting Kyle's. He didn't smile, but a warmth entered his expression. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acceptance, a dismissal, a lesson learned on both sides. The quiet moment was more meaningful than any public ceremony or medal could ever be. It was a small act of grace, a final peaceful landing after a lifetime of turbulence. Thank you for watching this story of valor. If you were moved by the courage and wisdom of General Norman Randall, the Carbon Fox, please hit the like button, share this video with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories of unassuming heroes.